Thank you very much. Mr. Massie, we're delighted you're here. You may offer
Thank,
your testimony.
thank you, Mr. Chairman, Chairman McGovern, Ranking Member Cole, and members of the committee. Thank you for allowing me to come here and testify on this bill. You know, as a member from the Eastern Time Zone, my district's in the Eastern Time Zone, I always wondered if we had an advantage over other members, but I'm glad to see that the Rules Committee removes all such advantages over living in any particular time zone because you meet at any time. Mr. Chairman, we all mourn the lives lost in the horrific tragedies in Buffalo and Uvalde. We should be working together to keep our schools and our communities safe. However, we can't keep people safe by limiting law-abiding citizens' rights to self-defense and assaulting Americans' constitutional rights. A couple of weeks ago, the House considered H.R. 2377, the Federal Extreme Risk Protection Order. At that time, many Republicans pointed out that the bill violated constitutional due process rights set out in the 5th and 14th Amendments by depriving individuals of their property rights without having been charged, arraigned, or convicted of a crime. The bill before us today is even more troubling. I would argue that it is a case of legislative laziness. The bipartisan Safer Communities Act, which is rushed over to this chamber after being rushed through the Senate, is a recipe for disaster. And I would note that we haven't had 3 days that we're supposed to have having a bill to review. And if this bill is that important, if it's the biggest gun bill in 30 years, gun control bill, as some have said, I think it deserves a little more time and consideration than it's being given today. It also comes the day after the Supreme Court has reaffirmed Americans' fundamental Second Amendment rights. The court's opinion could very well mean that this legislation is unconstitutional too, or some of the bills and laws that this legislation encourages the states to adopt could be unconstitutional. We should, at a minimum, take time to understand and have hearings about whether this bill comports with the Second Amendment in light of the court's recent decision. Instead, we are here rushing this bill through without even knowing whether it's constitutional. This bill pays the states hundreds of millions of dollars to implement so-called crisis intervention programs. These crisis intervention programs are just extreme risk protection orders, or red flag laws, rebranded with a new name. I guess the authors of this legislation realize that red flag laws are unpopular, and that's why we're changing the name of them here second time in this bill. But unlike the red flag laws we've considered a couple weeks ago, there is zero direction to the states on how to set these up. While the criteria were bad enough in the red flag provisions we considered recently, this bill lets states set up their own programs using their own criteria with the only advice from the authors that the provisions be constitutional. Now, I'm all for states' rights, but what we're doing here is we're robbing the money from the people and then going back and bribing the states to do something that's probably unconstitutional without giving them the guidelines. Because if we did give them guidelines, they probably would be unconstitutional guidelines because red flag laws turn due process on its end. That's probably the American people shouldn't be subject to kangaroo court proceedings because a handful of senators used an artificial deadline in rushing to pass a law for political reasons. When they couldn't agree on important issues like the right to be heard when facing a deprivation of rights, these senators threw some words on paper, hoping nobody would notice what a terrible and ambiguous scheme they were creating. And if this scheme becomes law, it flips the burden of proof to individuals. The burden would be on the individual to challenge such a system to protect their rights. This will undoubtedly be a costly and time-consuming endeavor. Let's also not forget the states have mental health laws that require commitment of individuals who pose a risk to themselves or others. For example, New York authorizes commitment for individuals who pose a substantial threat of harm to self or others. New York also has one of the most extensive red flag laws on the books in this country. Yet a year after this killing spree, the Buffalo shooter indicated, a year before his killing spree, the Buffalo shooter indicated that he wanted to commit murder-suicide at his high school, and even after psychological evaluation and referral to police, authorities took no further action. If these red flag laws worked, we would see evidence in states that already have them, but the reality is they just don't work. Paying states hundreds of millions of dollars to implement more of these types of laws will not make us any safer. In fact, a study conducted by the Crime Prevention Research Center in 2018 found that, quote, red flag laws had no significant effect on murder, suicide, the number of people killed in mass public shootings, robbery, aggravated assault, or burglary," unquote. Furthermore, data shows that many extreme risk protection orders have been overturned when the respondent finally has an opportunity to be heard. This is far from the only problem with this legislation. Perhaps most problematically, the bill contains a backdoor universal background check. Under the current law, to be considered engaged in the business of dealing firearms, an individual must have the principal objective of livelihood and profit. The bill changes that to, quote, "predominantly earn a profit." Who doesn't want to sell something for more than they paid for it? Is now anybody who sells a gun and sells it for more than what they paid for it engaged in the business of gun dealing without a license if they don't have a license? By lowering the threshold, this change will have the effect of criminalizing routine gun transactions between law-abiding Americans. The enhanced background checks on 18 to 20-year-olds will amount to an imposed waiting period for Americans between those ages to exercise their Second Amendment rights. I'm also concerned that it could have a racial disparity, the effect of this legislation by reaching back into the history of people when they were children. And one concern that I genuinely have about this bill is if a parent knows that seeking mental health will create a situation for their child when they grow up that they may have a stigma that they can't exercise a basic fundamental right, will that parent neglect or avoid seeking help for that child when, in fact, the brain is still forming and there could be an intervention that could stop this child from going off track? I'm worried that that stigma that this bill would cause and the deprivation of rights as an adult for seeking help as a child will cause parents not to seek that help. And we could see more dangerous situations because of that. I urge an open rule on this extremely flawed bill. We really do need to have some amendments and some more debate on it. And I thank the chairman and the ranking member, and I yield back.
Thank you. Well, I'm not going to say anything. I'll yield to Mr. Cole.
Just a couple of quick questions to my friend to Kentucky. Mr. Massie, what provisions in this legislation, in your view, restrict Second Amendment rights?
Well, the Democrats often say they don't want to take your guns away. But what is a red flag law? It's taking your guns away. It's not taking some of your guns away. It's taking all of your guns away. And I think the most troubling provision in here is the red flag provision where we are bribing the states to adopt it. Many states already have some form of red flag law that's not working, and all 50 states in the union have laws known as Baker Act or 5150 in California that allow individuals to be involuntarily committed and to have their firearms taken away. But the difference with those existing laws and what this bill promotes is that there's due process, that there's a mental health expert involved, that you are appointed a lawyer if you can't afford one, and you get the right to meet your accuser, just basic fundamental due process rights.
Okay, and many people have stated, and you alluded to this, that this is, quote, the most significant piece of legislation impacting gun laws in 3 decades. But your committee had no hearings on this legislation. Is that correct?
That is correct. I was before this committee a week or two ago, and we have marked up multiple bills in our Judiciary Committee, gun bills. This has very little resemblance to any of those. And I think really the Committee of Jurisdiction here in Congress should be looking at legislation like this. Why can't we do the Senate bill and a House bill and then bring them to conference and resolve the differences? Why are we going to defer to a bunch of sleep-deprived senators who've rushed this thing over to us and just rubber stamp it? It should go through committee.
And your committee didn't hold a markup on this legislation, did it?
We had no hearing and no markup on this legislation.
What about on the other side? Just out of curiosity, I know you follow this issue. Did they have a committee process?
They had a process. Some of them met behind closed doors, and then they wheeled this thing out and rushed it onto the floor. If you call that a process, it's not a good process.
I don't think they did not have a hearing. They did not have a markup. You describe it exactly right. We had a self-appointed group get together, put something together, talking only to themselves, and then basically rush it through. And that's essentially what's happening here. You know, we are basically abdicating our institutional power and responsibility by not going through our own process with this legislation. It ought to go before your committee. It ought to have a hearing, it ought to have a markup, and then we ought to act. We shouldn't be sitting here just simply accepting whatever a group of senators decided they wanted to do. That's not the way this system was envisioned to work. So anyway, I thank you for coming here on such short notice, because you didn't have much notice at all, and so early in the morning, because again, we're intent on subverting our own process to get something through, to meet the deadline of a lot of senators who want to get home. That's really the only reason here we're moving with this kind of speed and without any deliberation or appropriate process, in my view. So again, I thank my friend for coming here on such short notice. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Mrs. Torres.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for calling us even at 7 a.m. On a Friday to take up this legislation. You know, I guess I would agree with the ranking member on one thing, and that is that this certainly isn't the most significant